Action. Hello, this is Will Harold, the energy hunter with Akashic Intelligence, the original AI coming from the beautiful Rogue River in Southern Oregon with the Secret of Light study group who follows Walter Russell. And we are now in part three, and this, I believe, is about the seventh or eighth installment of part three, but part three has a lot of diagrams and a lot of um, information on that explains parts one and two. So we're going to dive deep into that. We're also going to talk a bit about atomic suicide, which was another book that Walter Russell wrote with his wife, his second wife, Leo Russell, in which they expanded on some of the ideas and concepts of radiation and how radiation is affecting the Earth and what the future of the Earth will be like if this radiation wave and focus on radioactivity isn't stopped or at least mitigated and really addressed, and what the future will look like if that is not addressed. So let's dive in right now. We're taking off from where we left off last week. And we're going to talk a little bit about the spiral in nature. So if we can look at the diagram here on the screen, this is a diagram which is, and I think Giselle was saying earlier, it's kind of hard to understand. And I have some other diagrams I put together to hopefully make it a little bit more understandable. But what we have here in the center is north. So when you think about north, you think about everything that wants to point in. So when you look at this diagram, the first thing you have to look at is the in, and then you have to look at the direction of the arrows. So east to north so these are all compressive forces, right? Going into the center, compression, right? So, and this is called the universal compass. So on all four sides, we have east to north compressing in. From the center out, we would have radial waves, right? Radiation going from west to south. Again, we know that north is positive, it's compressive, it's male, it's red. Coming out is radiation. It's cold, it's blue, it's negative, it's female. So the compression waves are coming in from east to north because north is positive, coming into the compressive wave. Going out radially is from west to south, and these are all west to south. They're all going south because south is to the negative. The north, going to north, is to the positive, the red, the positive. Out is blue, female, negative. So within the wave field, centripetal, which is red, which is positive, which is male, centripetal spirals wind light waves into spheres. So as we have this going into this north, this is beginning to wind it into matter, into density. And then cease to be spirals. Centrifugal, which is negative, which is blue, which is cold, spirals upward spheres into cubes. This gets to what we call the cubosphere. So we go from spheres to cubes, and also cease to be spirals. Centripetal and centrifugal spirals are electric. So when we look at this here, this is the diagram that he shows. So the law, generating matter seeks higher pressure zones. So generating, which means concentrating, which means positive, which means male, which means hot, seeks higher pressure zones. So as we talked about, as these waves are coming into the Earth towards the center, the deeper we go into the center of the Earth, the greater the compression, the greater the generating matter. So just as someone on a mountaintop would weigh less than if they were on a plane that we talked about last week, as we get closer to the center of the Earth, the density increases till it hits the center, then it reverses and begins to radiate back into cold, and it radiates out. So we have this spiraling in of discharging and charging going on, equal but opposite, but based upon the potential of the force. So the greater the concentration, the greater the potential, and then that turns around, and as it radiates, that potential lessens, and that's why space is vast and solids are very concise. So these were some diagrams I put together because they weren't in this portion, but they really, I think, expand and explain on some of the concepts that we talked about last week. And one of those was the whole idea of, these equators that he calls the dynamic and the static equator. And oftentimes he'll just show like a diagram like this with this line going down the middle, of the charge and discharge, which you would call the shaft. He often calls this line the shaft. And it would seem like, the way that I was thinking last week was that, he says that these shafts go from the center of the sun to the center of the earth. But then he says that the equator, which is here, which is what he also calls the static equator, is from east to west. But when you think about that, well, how's that work? Because if the sun's over here and we're on this line, then how can this go to the center? Well, I found this diagram that actually explains it, because what it's showing here is that this is not like on a line plane. This energy actually that comes into the poles, or applied or assumed poles, can come in from the sun like this to the top. It doesn't have to come in a direct line like this. So the sun doesn't have to be over here and this connects center to center. This can go from the center and then come around and connect here. So what he's saying is, as we have this dynamic pole, so a planet in its youthful stage would be this planet here. So we see youth, right? We see this planet, and it's somewhat, it's almost like an ellipse, right? It's elliptical in shape, not a true sphere because it's young. But we still have the North Pole, we still have the South Pole. The North, as you see, is a positive. The South is the negative. So this is the father, this is the positive, this is the red, this is the hot, this is the negative, this is the cold, this is the female, this is blue. But in the center here, we would have what we call the static axis, and this is the dynamic axis. So around this, what he would call the equator, as you can see, there's pluses and minuses here, right? So this would be the side that is actually receiving the positive flow that's coming in. This would be the sunlight side, where you see all these negative, which actually are, he's saying, happen at this this dynamic equator here. As you can see, at this point between this pole is where we change from the positive to the negative. Now on this diagram here, he's actually showing this, shaft, which we would call the dynamic axis, the yellow dynamic axis, is actually offset from where this energy or this shaft is coming in. See how the energy is coming in kind of over here. It's not actually coming into the exact shaft until that planet matures and actually becomes a perfect sphere. Then the energy comes in at the top and at the bottom at the exact pole lines, with the dynamic axis then being completely vertical and the static axis being horizontal. But again, we still have the same relationship of positive on one side of the axis or equator, negative on the other. But as this spins, the surface would change from positive to negative. And I think I talked about this a little bit last week, where Abraham Karim says this is the side in which we receive negative green energy on. So as the sun comes through, we actually get this negative side. So we're seeing this negative energy coming off the backside of the planet, or the dark side, what some of us would call, but it's also this positive energy. Now, as you see here, I think Doug this is the bisexual position. So in this position, the planet would be called bisexual, being neutral in both cases of polarity and sex. Now, and it's in equilibrium at this point, which he's also calling bisexual, or you could call it hermaphroditic or whatever. Now, as the planet matures, because all things, as we know, generate, right? They hit a point of stasis and they begin to degenerate back into radiation. So he would call it declination, right? Declination, meaning that it's in decline. It's in a radiative form. Now, what Walter Russell says that for a man or a human, this actually occurs somewhere around the age 40 or 45. This would be, for a human body, this would be a body that's in their 40s, 45 would be at this maturity or equilibrium. And then the body would become and turn into a declination state where it would begin to decline and begin to radiate more than it gravitates. And the cells, or the makeup of the body they would become less spherical and more elliptical. And as you can see here, what happens in this, he didn't really talk about, but if from this diagram, again, we have the static axis and the dynamic axis, but they're actually, declining or in declination to the opposite. But also the poles change. You see this? Now north is negative and south is positive. So oftentimes you hear that, our poles are changing, and that really is something that Walter Russell would say that the Earth would go through as it's in this declination cycle, as it begins to decline. And again, the power or the thing that is coming into this shaft from the sun is not again aligned with the poles, right? It's actually kind of coming in offset here. Can you see that? It's not on the pole. Because the pole, this is called the dynamic axis, and this is called the static axis. We talked about last week and the week before. They have to be at 90 degrees to each other.
Now the Earth is not as tilted, but not that much. Not the way.
Correct. It's probably between this stage and this stage at this time. It's not, but then here, as it ages out again, now we have the south actually moving to the top and the north to the bottom. And we actually have, again, the power coming in is quite a bit different in location. So this is just how the sphere of our planet, how that matter interacts per Russell with the sun as it goes through its cycle of radiation and gravitation of what we'd call, youth and then declination, which is from here at this point it would begin to become more and more flattened and begin to throw off rings at the center, such as Saturn and other planets. We have, and those rings would become moons or different things, or some would actually just become asteroids and go back into the sun. So at this point, as the Earth or any planet begins to degenerate or decline, it would begin to break up and then go back to the sun. So within this,
and moving through those, he's showing them. Does he talk about that fact that they're wandering all over the place?
Yes, I mean he has that in another diagram.
Right.
But so if you look at this, what you're seeing here, so this outer circle would be the outer edge of the planet, right? This again would be this equator or axis, which we call the dynamic with static equator or static axis. This is the dynamic. This is the static axis. So this is the dynamic axis. This is the static axis. And if you look at this, what this zone is, you see the word Capricorn and Cancer. So these would be the lines of the tropics, right? The Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. So he's actually, pretty much staying pretty standard to our current scientific or materialistic idea of a globe with actually even these, and within these ranges, is where this elliptical expansion would take place. So this is where these rings would be thrown off that we're talking about, because these are the areas of discharge and these are the areas of charge, okay? So this, again, is this dynamic axis where we have this discharge and charge going on. So you can see these spirals going around. And again, here you see south by way of west. I don't know if you can see that or not. Just all right here. But that goes back, right, to this original diagram up here, right, west to south, right? So this right here is kind of a three-dimensional image of that two-dimensional universal compass, showing this discharge, north by way of east. Okay, see how it's winding into the center here? Winding into the center, discharging out. Okay, so this is his diagram. So analysis of this planet's potential position, its oblateness and its inclination to its own and to the solar ecliptic. So this oblateness means that it's beginning to get wider in the center, discharging out, and its inclination is these areas that we've talked about as it inclines from one to upright to equilibrium, and then begins to decline as it ages, and then eventually goes into obliteration. So all mass is formed by a contraction of the electric poles of the generative cones of energy. So here's the generative cones of energy that we see, and they point energy to the point of north at its gravitation center. So here's the gravitation center, and by the expansion of the contours of the radiated cones until they disappear into the plane of the equator. So here we have this degeneration out, right? Getting larger on the outside, meaning that the volume is expansive, going out, and discharging back into the sun. So here's kind of a larger picture of that we're going to cover a little bit later too. But you know, we see this again. This kind of gets back to that universal compass that we looked at just at the very beginning, where we see that the north is being shown not, you know, at one pole or the other truly, but kind of as the center. Here is the planet as it obligates to the center here, with everything going out towards the south, right? South, south, south. And these other things beginning to be integrated into the center, which forms the mass. And then as it radiates out back to the south, back to negative, back to radiation, that is how it will disintegrate. So radiation is what breaks form down into formlessness, and gravitation is what forms formlessness into form. So any questions so far of what we've talked about in these diagrams that we discussed, the radiation and gravitation and this west to south, and the ideas of the energies of the sun coming in, and as the planet ages, it goes through certain cycles. All planets do this, and all planets do this as they grow and as they deteriorate. So I brought up this quote because I'm also reading Atomic Suicide at the same time. And again, like I said, Atomic Suicide is the book that was one of the later and last books written. So it took a lot of this information that's in The Secret of Light, that's in the idea of a new universe, and different books that Walter Russell wrote, and actually made it a little bit more concise, but also had a great warning in it, because a lot of the work that Russell did actually began to develop the periodic table, which at that time, plutonium and different elements were not known.
The isotopes, yeah.
Yeah, and so he actually was one of the forerunners to the atomic age, to identifying these, you know, radiation, and that these, based on the octave, which we're going to cover, I think, next week, that these elements existed, even though at the time they weren't found. But the
Still told them to do it.
yeah, but his admonition was that in the Atomic Suicide was that radiation is the normal death principle. So that's what we're seeing here, right? And when we say death, again, this is death of matter, not death of the conscience. These are two different things. The death is really the death of matter, not of man. Uh, it's really how, because as we age, our bodies will concentrate and then they'll disintegrate, just as anything else, but our consciousness will stay intact. It will just change its place of residence and its nature. So everything in nature dies normally by slowly radiating its heat. So when you're young, I mean, you look at a baby, they're hot, right? They're always hot. They're never cold, right? Because they're just little furnaces, because they're just totally in concentration, right? They're totally in gravitation all the time as they're growing, as they're, but as we age, what happens? We begin to get colder, right? Our extremities get colder, our hands get colder, our feet get colder. And then as we actually, when the guy comes in and says, there's nobody longer in this body, it is cold, right? Your body is cold. So you've lost all your heat. So this idea that as we age, as the body begins to degenerate, that it becomes cold, that is the natural process, that we lose our heat through this radiative process. Now, radioactivity is the explosive quick death principle. So when you have radioactivity, what you have is you sped the cycle up. And how do you speed the cycle up? Well, you increase the amount of wave activity that gets us into a higher degree of concentration and gravitation, because once we hit that critical stage of total gravitation, it becomes spontaneous, and it becomes, it ignites, basically. And at that point is when we begin to radiate. At that point of radiation is really kind of the maximum effect, because radiation is at its peak when it is initial. When it turns from gravitation to radiation is when it's at its peak, because as it expands out, it actually becomes more voluminous, right? And loses its potential. So radiation has its highest potential at its initiation, to where gravitation has its highest potential, at its ending, not at its beginning.
Think about the baby, though. The baby's growing.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't it be radiation? But isn't it?
It is. It's doing both, Doug. Again, don't forget, it's not like the cycle comes in and then it goes out. It's happening simultaneously together, correct? So as this baby, it's because the baby's hot, not because of radiation. The baby's hot because of gravitation. But what's happening is this gravitation, just like the sun, is beginning to increase the baby's growth as it's radiating. So it keeps radiating. That body keeps radiating until the age of about 45, like we said.
By hot, though, it's no hotter than you or I. I mean, isn't
Maybe it is, but I don't know if you ever felt one. They feel, they always seem to be red and pretty hot. I mean, a baby, their temperature is, but they're actually, it seems like they're radiating more heat than what we do. At least that's my, yeah. That's my experience anyway. With children, even they always seem hot. Much more so than grandma, So radioactivity is man's discovery of how the human race can die quickly. Okay, so this is saying a lot right here, because radioactivity is a man's discovery of how the human race can die quickly. So once we discovered radioactivity and we discovered how we could harness radioactivity, we discovered how we can actually extinct man faster. How we can actually not only extinct man, but extinct all life on Earth faster. And not be able to propagate its kind for many long centuries.
That's assuming that Zeus didn't have the rod of God and all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, and the idea is here is that, at the time that Walter Russell was talking with atomic suicide, it was about the Curies and everybody, getting all these mass, mining of plutonium and radium and stuff out of the ground and breaking it up to get small chunks of radiation, in which Curie died from herself, right? From radiation. But that's a very hard way to get radiation, right? It's a hard way to actually, build atomic bombs. And, there's some questions of whether or not there is atomic and nuclear weapons. I believe Russell thought there were. But again, it's a very expensive, very time-consuming way to produce radioactivity. There's much easier ways to produce some of the same effects, and that's through creating waves that mimic radioactivity, right? Because again, we're talking that the radioactivity is just a wave. That's all it is. It's
That guy that worked at the, you remember that video where the guy he goes swimming in the water?
Well, again, I don't know. I just know what Walter Russell's saying, and I know that if you get too much, X-rays, it's not good for you. I mean, I know.
Yeah, he wasn't talking X-rays, but he was talking the water that they use for the cooling. He used to swim in that water.
That's fine. But again, what Walter Russell's saying is that radioactivity is the way of death. Okay, it's the way. This wave that is created is, as we speed that up, as we actually create radioactivity for the human body, it will begin to kill us faster and begin to kill everything around us. It will kill our entire area. It will kill everything. Now,
seems logical. It is happening. I'm sorry.
Yes, it is happening, right? I mean, and what Walter Russell said was that radiation in itself was not bad. It was meant to be inside the earth, deep in the earth, to actually break down and create minerals and water from rocks and all these kind of things. So it had its purpose within the inner core of the earth, under the ground, that was shielded from men. As we begin to discover radioactivity, the power of radiation, the power of fission, we begin to dig that up and bring that out, which then exposed it to the atmosphere, to the elements, and actually created the negativity associated with radioactivity and the nuclear explosions and so on. Again, like I said, that was one way to create radioactivity. Another way to create radioactivity is to increase wave signals that mimic radioactivity. And those wave signals come from electromagnetic towers, they come from microwaves, they come from 5G, they come from any wave that we're now introducing into our system that is a much, stronger wave than what is natural. Sunlight itself has a very high concentration of radiation, but that's a certain amount that our body can handle. Once we begin to introduce all these additional radioactive waves into our atmosphere, it's like we are lighting off hundreds of atomic bombs over and over again around our planet. Because these waves that are generated those same waves would be generated by a nuclear explosion. So what I'm saying is, you don't have to have a nuclear explosion to have radioactive waves. You can create them, radiation waves, by their form. So they're interchain borns, all forms, and likewise voids, all forms. Centripetal, hot, positive, male spirals are electropositive, meaning they're positive, right? They wind light inward into incandescent spheres. So that's how the sun's being formed, being wound into incandescent spheres. They are the father light, which refolds unfolding forms. They begin their half cycle at cube boundary planes of wave fields and in them at centers of spheres. So that's when the centripetal force ends at the center. Once it gets to the center, then that's the maximum as it begins to radiate out. So figure 47 over here, the 6 outer mirrors of gravitation. We're seeing the 4 with the 2 inside. Reflect gravitating light centripetally inward through the poles. Centrifugal spirals are electronegative, right? Cold, female, south, blue. They unwind light of incandescent spheres into cold black light of space. So as we begin to have the centripetal force come down into the center, once it hits its center, it is at its highest potentiation, and then it begins to reverse back out, which is the next highest potentiation for the radiation force or the centrifugal force, because that's right where it's originating at. As it expands out, it gets less and less and less and loses its potential. So right at that peak between the compression, right? This is like an atomic bomb. You condense it down, and then as it explodes out, right at that point is the highest point of radiation, because it's at its highest potentiation, because it's at its smallest volume. Remember how we talked about the volume of space versus the volume? But at that instance where they cross over from gravitational to radiation is the highest potentiation of the centrifugal or radiative or negative principle. So they unwind light of incandescent spheres into cold black light of space. They are the mother light, which unfolds formlessness into form. So as we see this, right, again, here is kind of that diagram, but we again see the east and the west and so on and so forth. And this actually is mimicking those other diagrams that we've talked about, but actually in the context of the cubosphere, which he uses as his cube being unwound and being wound. They begin their half cycles at centers of rest in spheres and in them in the reprojection mirrors of wave field planes. So as we have here, we have the idea of the projected, as the reprojection mirrors. Again, we talked about, we have the one plane here, right? The other plane here, and then the four on the outside. So this forms the cubosphere here, with these planes being how these energy are reflected back. And so within these is where these spheres are formed. They begin their half cycle at centers of rest in spheres, and in them in the reprojected mirrors of wave field planes. Figure 48, which is right here, diagrams the 6 mirror planes which project radiating light centrifugally outward from equators. So we talk about the 6 planes here. Figure 49 here diagrams the screen of space, which simulates motion because of the two-way projection of oppositely conditioned lights inward, which is positive, which is hot, which is centipedal, and outward through each other to create the illusion of motion, change, sequence, and time. So as we see here, here is the centering, right? The shaft that we talked about coming in. Here is the centripetal and centrifugal motion forming at the center here a sphere of the cube. So spheres and spherical systems like carbon, which is what we are, carbon-based systems, are born where centripetal and centrifugal spirals meet. So at that dynamic of the two meeting is where carbon is formed, which is what we are, which is a carbon-based life form. Matter registers the potential of the position of its birth. For that reason, it floats in equipotential orbits appropriate to its position in its wave field, together with all the units of its system. In the electric current electronic system are born where the familiar loop of force occurs around a charged wire. So in diagram 50, 51, 52, and 53, we're actually beginning to see the centripetal and centrifugal forming the spheres at where these meet at these cones, where we have this one coming down to its point, this one beginning to open up and concentrate back. And so the spiral is an incomplete sphere, just as crystal forms are incomplete cubes. Spirals and crystals have individuality which they lose by avoidance in the oneness of spheres and cubes. So what's interesting is here we're talking about crystals and forms and that they're incomplete cubes, and that in order to create orgone, we actually initiate with with crystals in there. So we're actually maybe taking some of the dynamics of this idea of the incomplete cube of radiation to actually generate some energies that may help within the orgone generation. Individuality is given bodies for the purpose of manifesting separateness and multiplicity. Individuality, separateness, and multiplicity are then voided into oneness. So this is also the condition of the human race, right? As we come into form, as we come into this time, as we come into the 3D, we get our ID, we get our id, right? We get our ego. We have separateness, right? We begin to form separateness. We begin to form individuality. We begin to have our forms. This is really when some people talk about the fall, right? The fall into density. This is really what some people say is that they're speaking of, is that we begin to fall into density so that we could actually have this individuality. Because before this, we didn't have form. We were all kind of one. We were in with the oneness of the Creator. So we're going to form, we're going to go out. So enjoy your individuality. We're supposed to have it. This is what we are meant to do, is to go out and have individuality, to have separateness, to feel that and to experience that, because we all are going to radiate back to oneness again. So as we're in form, oneness is not totally the purpose right now. Individuality and separateness is our cycle currently. We will come back into oneness as we radiate back to source. But the purpose of our cycle right now is individuality and separateness. So individuality in every creating thing is a moment-to-moment record of its unfoldment and refoldment. It is the fruit of cosmic desire for creative expression. It begins with a cycle. It begins when the cycle begins, ends with its ending, and repeats itself in each cycle until the entire cycle of any expressed idea is voided in its completion. Two-way sex condition spirals are the consummate individuals of all creation. They condition all bodies with the condition of their bodies. They unfold all idea from stillness of mind knowing into moving form of mind imagining, and refold it into the stillness of mind knowing. They are the electric workers which fulfill desire of mind. So when we see the desire of mind, we're talking source here. So this two-way sex condition spirals that we talk about, these spirals here, these two-way sex condition spirals, mean positive, negative, male, female, father, mother. These are the two workers that are the electric workers which fulfill desire of mind by interweaving threads of light into pattern forms and recording those pattern forms into the still light, which centers every spiral pair as the axis of a cone centers the cone. So again, we've talked about this axis, right? We saw how that axis, which we call the dynamic axis, which runs through the center, which is the shaft, which centers the cone. This runs through all, right? Not just the planet, but through us too, through our bodies, through everything. And this centers these cones, and this is what creates the idea of matter at the intersection. The one centering axis of both spirals is the shaft we just talked about, upon which the dynamic universe rotates on the dynamic equator, or the dynamic axis, which is what we talked about, which is shown as this yellow line, right? We've been showing the dynamic axis or equator as a yellow line, and the static equator axis is an orange line. So as we look at this diagram here, right, the familiar wave lines, which records all effects of motion, controls those effects. One can record that wave line, but is not aware of the fact that it is the power extended by the Creator in the measure of the desire of power. So we can record this, meaning that we can see it, we can visualize it, we can see it in matter, but we are not aware of the fact that it is the power extended from the Creator in the measure of the desire. So once we can actually begin to see this in matter and begin to realize that it is from the Creator or from Source, and that it is on an axis, and that it is being created in a certain way for us, and that it is part of this wave structure, then we can actually begin to see God in all things. We can begin to see Source in all things. The wave line is a record of the amount of energy borrowed from its static equator. So again, AA is the static equator, right? Dynamic equator, static equator, where the sphere is formed. To express any mechanical process, such as the vibration of a harp string, the pulsation of an engine, the cardiogram of one's heartbeat, or the pattern of an earthquake as recorded by a seismograph. These goes through the different diagrams here, 54, 55, so on. Through all these diagrams here that we've kind of looked at, 53, 54. So as we look at this, the shaft of a wave is a line drawn through every point upon the surface of a wave, distributed ocean in a vertical section where water and sky meet. Around the still shaft of the wave, all motion of the wave spiral to interweave the patterns and forms of desire. So again, if we look at this would be the this right here. Wait, this is the orange, so this is the static axis, and this would be the dynamic axis, correct? Going this way. So static and dynamic axis. So all spiral forms must have intense individuality in order to express such amazing varieties of form and pattern. The inside outside in turnings of all creative form is due to the gradual unfolding, refolding principle of nature. This process is controlled by spiral pairs, which are motivated by still centering shafts of magnetic light, still centering shafts, right? We call this the dynamic. Opposed pairs of spirals gradually expand centrifugally to planes meeting at static equators. There's a static equator, right? We talked about that. So what he's saying is these planes will come and they'll meet here at these static equators. To complete the unfolding half of a cycle. They then contract as the opposite what they are to complete the other half. During the entire journey, they continue without reversal of direction. A clockwise spiral is always a clockwise spiral, which is positive during an entire centripetal journey. So clockwise centripetal to its apex and its centrifugal journey to its base. The opposed pair which rotate upon the same shaft are anti-clockwise for both are projected through each other. The characteristic unfolding, refolding, inside out, outside in principle of nature causes the integration of matter at poles and disintegration at equators. So again, he's just repeating the same things that we talked about up in the diagrams, where in the center we have the obligation, whatever you want to call it, where we begin to expand in the center and throw off the rings, just as Saturn is, and then at the tops is where we begin to actually pull in the other at their poles. So if you look at a sphere, we have poles top and bottom. At the center, east and west, we have the area in which we have the disintegration at equators. Matter integrates by the contraction of one pair of spirals around the shaft, which wind into spheres by the way of their poles and disintegrate by an expansion by the other pairs, which unwind by way of their equators. The pair of spirals which wind light waves into spheres continue that winding until holes are bored through spheres and rings are formed. So as we have these spheres, we have holes being bored, which then will begin to form rings. And I was trying to pull up some diagrams of spheres with rings, and I couldn't find those, but they are out there. And the majestic ring nebula in Lyra, figure 61, which I believe is even farther down here, right here. We can see the rings being formed around the centering principle there. So the rings of Saturn, okay, so we see that it is an outstanding example of the disintegration process of nature. The ring exemplifies the death half of the cycle, and the newly formed sun at its center of the life. A new body has been born out of the old one as it expanded into the heavens. So expansion, right? Radiation has expanded out. A new one. The heavens abound with new bodies appearing from old ones, which have disappeared into another form. The Owl Nebula demonstrates this principle by 2 rings and 2 stars reborn from them. The rings of Saturn will become moons. So as this material is expanded out, they become moons, just as its other rings have become several other moons. Our own moon was born from a ring from Earth as it expands. It's hulked by absorbing its oceans and accelerates its rotation as all of the outer planets have done. So at least, there's some questions here that have been answered. So from Walter Russell's perspective, the moon is a solid object. It probably is a sphere, and it came from the Earth. Now, this, if you read Steiner's cosmologies of our different existences, that we were once moon beings, that there are moon beings, and from the moon, as it broke away and formed the Earth, some of us stayed on the Earth, and some of the beings stayed on the moon that did not actually ascend into an Earth existence. And so there is actually degenerated beings on the moon. That's a whole different study, but it actually is kind of in line with a lot of what Russell's saying here, because as these different planets begin to form from the remnants of other planets, this kind of allows for some of the ideas in which they talk about how the human and how beings are ascend and descend, and if those that don't make it through the initiations of the planets that they're on, which is another completely interesting topic. So as we talk about this, and as we talk about waves, and as we talk, I kind of want to bring it back into, a practical sense of really what are we talking about? What are waves? What are happening, and so on. So one thing that I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about was the development of cellular technology and communication. So, we started out with 1G, which was basic voice service using analog products. So back in 1981, now we'd already gone through creating electromagnetic waves with electricity. We've already gone through creating radio waves, which are also an analog wave. We also created television, which had its own analog wave. And now we're pushing into 1G, first generation of the cellular wave, which was basically just voice services. They were very large phones, and they connected. Then in 1992, so 11 years later, we got to our 2G, which was designed primarily for voice using the digital standards. So we went from this analog process. 11 years later, we're now into a digital process. Then from 1992, 9 years later, we came out with 3G. Again, the G just stands for generation. It's a generation of the protocol. We had the first mobile broadband using IP protocols. So these were these phones. I don't know if you guys remember these phones.
The G stands for geriatrics, which it creates.
And so from 2000, another 9 years, we were at 100 MIPS. So, we are at 2 kips, 64 kips, 2 to
Bits
10,
per second.
yeah, megabytes per second. So this was
Bits.
this was the true mobile broadband on a unit. So, 2010 was really when we started getting into our smartphones, which was a fourth generation. And then here at 2020, right, is when they were saying that we were going to get the 10 gigabytes per second. I mean, look at the difference here, 10 gigabytes to 100 megabytes. This is a huge difference.
It's 1 terabyte a second. It's
One,
already
yeah.
6G.
So tactile internet with services, aware devices, and fiber-like speeds. So these are waves that were being run like through fiber in the ground, just as we had radiation in the ground before with, the plutonium and all those other things that were down in the ground. Now that's all being moved actually into the air, which, is really the age of Aquarius, right? Where things are going to move into the air, the age of information moving into the air. But as these waves move into the air, they actually create this radiative cycle, which mimics radiation or nuclear explosions in a sense, because the waveforms are being put into the atmosphere, and we're experiencing those just as if, small atomic explosions were taking place all the time. So
Like very, 5G is it doesn't go through a wall even. It doesn't go through anything.
And so when we look at this, we have like an MRI, which is really a magnetic process, which is still, a very smooth linear wave, right? So this is really where you look at that low potential wave, right? Because it's very, very long. There's low potential to it. Therefore, the impacts on us are very mild. And, so we went from the MRI to electricity, right? As I talked about, where.
MRI is safe, huh? I didn't know that.
So as we, began to get the analog waves, but just think how many waves that are being put in. Every time we put up a tower, we're introducing new waves, right? So with electricity, we built electricity towers, right? Those were generating waves, right? Then we built, radio towers. They were generating waves, right? And they're still very smooth, long, the non-ionizing waves, right? And then we got TV, and we're still, we're still, the wave is starting to get a little bit more and more condensed. We have mobile and cellular, right? We have satellite. We have a heat lamp, which is in this area. Then we have visible light. We have ultraviolet light. We have X-rays and gamma rays. And as we begin to see these gigahertz, the idea of the wave being condensed and more condensed, all these waves are leading to higher and higher gravitational exposure, right? That's what we see, condensing, right? The waveform, which will eventually lead to the reverse, which will be the radiation of that heat back out. So as we begin to absorb these waves in the human form, in the human body, we will have to, this is what happens when we, put a cell phone to our head for too long. It gets very hot. We begin to absorb all this heat, and all this heat is going to have to be radiated back out. And at that point is where we actually probably will have some very big health issues as we begin to experience all these waves and the condensation of these waves, condensing of these waves in our form, in our tissues, and in our bodies. So, this is just like what Walter Russell's saying about radiation. This is what's happening. We didn't have a nuclear war, but we have a wave war. We've mimicked the experience of a nuclear war in the structure of the waves that are being generated, if you understand what I'm saying there. The effects are the same. If a bomb was exploded, these waves would be put out into the atmosphere. We're transmitting these waves from towers now, rather than from bombs. So, they're saying that the adverse effects of wireless radiation on humans is reactive oxygen species, so sensory disorders, neurodegeneration, genotoxicity, and carcinogenicity, and sleep disorders. So I don't know if anybody's, a lot of people I talk to say they're having a lot of problems sleeping. And when you look at like what are some of the um, protocols for the current pandemics that are out there, one of them is to take melatonin, right? Melatonin. Why do you take melatonin? You take that to sleep, right? Why are you having to take that? Well, because you have sleep disorders, right? That's one of the first signs is these sleep disorders. Then you have the immunotoxicity and inflammation, congenital abnormalities, right? You have infertility. You have neurobehavioral, right? So this is when people start becoming unhinged. Right here, people begin to lose with this neurodegeneration. You'll start seeing people that are going to have problems with their extremities. They're going to have problems with feeling. They're going to have, you know, from people I'm listening to, these are a lot of the symptoms that are occurring right now with people. They're having a lot of sleep disorders. They're having a lot of sensory disorders, and they're having a lot of these neurobehavioral abnormalities and inflammation and toxicity. So, you know, when people talk about, is this a radiation poisoning going on? I believe it is. I believe when we look out and we see all the trees dying, I think they're dying from radiation poisoning. They're drying out, you know. When I talked to firefighters around these fires, they say they've never seen the forest so dry, even though it hasn't been extended drought periods, you know, over and over again. There's been some droughts, but not like, you know, 30-year drought where everything would dry out. Something's drying out our environment, and it's really, as Walter Russell stated, it's the quick death process of radioactivity. So again, here are some of the diagrams that Walter was showing for this. Jupiter is even now developing belts which will be thrown off his rings. So it's in the degenerative process, again, as the diagrams I showed in the beginning with the planets and their different processes. These moons will become comets and eventually plunge into the sun. All things in the solar system, like so, they're going from concentration of planets to radiative to throwing off the material, going back to the sun, where it will be condensed and thrown back out again. This is the cycle of the wave. Figure 64 illustrates the unwinding process by means of which moons free themselves from the bindings of their mother's shaft to again seek revolution around the shaft of their beginning in the sun. So as these elements are thrown off from the main core sphere, they will still seek to go around the shaft, which is at the poles. Therefore, they will still seek to go around these shafts based on the inclination of the poles of the planet and its cycle within its degenerative cycle. Degeneration of suns and planets by radiation is accompanied by flattening at their poles. Spheres come into being by prolating and go out by oblating. So that's what we talked about. Oblating is when it becomes oblated, which becomes spherical. Ever increasing speed of rotation around shafts is the cause of this phenomenon. Inner planets rotate very slowly upon their own shafts because they are so close to their mother shaft in the sun. But they revolve very swiftly in the orbits around the sun. So again, here's the diagram I showed earlier. I thought it was better being shown earlier because it was more expressive of what was being talked about. Mercury, our own moon, and Phobos, the inner moon of Mars, are so close to their mother shaft that they are obliged to revolve swiftly with the same face always toward their primary. The other planets have so far broken away from the influence of their mother shaft in the sun that their years have materially lengthened, their days conspicuously shortened, and their faces have constantly changing in relation to the sun. Cyclones, waterspouts, and tornadoes develop on the Earth when spirals tighten around their shafts, for the more and thus contract, the greater their speed. When spirals are so wide at their base that their angles to the Earth's surface are negligible, there is calmness and peace. But when they contract to thin pencils to imperious speed around the centering shafts of magnetic stillness at 90 degrees to the Earth's surface, they do inestimable damage. Inestimable damage. So unable to estimate. So this is the idea of how when we get cyclones and tornadoes and actually weather patterns, which are, when you look at a weather pattern, it's very much this spiral that's happening. You see that all the time on the face of the earth. So the idea of this, as the storm grows, it begins to get faster and faster. It grows centripetally and begins to condense, and then as it will dissipate, it will radiate out and dissipate out. So these ideas of radiation and concentration or gravitation are throughout all things, and they're focused around these axes or shafts or equators that Walter Russell talks about. So this is bringing now a close to the ideas of centrifugal and centripetal radiation, gravitation, some of these ideas of how planets and such are formed. The next thing that we're going to get into here is this universal octave, which I find to be fascinating, but it actually will get down into how elements are formed within the octave and how different ideas are broken down into the four corners of the cubosphere, and the 8 corners of the cubosphere to form the octave. So that's what we're going to be talking about next week. Is there any questions so far of what we covered today with gravitation, radiation, planets, how Walter Russell describes them being formed and then disintegrating back out and returning to source?
I think it's fascinating, the whole gravitation and radiation, and how radiation is basically disintegration, of the physical aspect of things. And one thing that kind of came up for me is like, when are these mad, I don't even know the word, when are we going to stop fucking with the environment and stuff? That's I'm kind of angry at the same time, like, because all this radiation is part, we're kind of doing it to ourselves in a lot of ways too, with how we're extracting our resources from the earth and living and all that stuff. So
well, again,
out there,
somewhat for me is when you're going to throw away your cell phone, right?
Yeah.
That's without a cell phone, we don't need 5G, right?
We don't need 5G, period.
Well, but I'm just saying, we could go back to back to just talk and text, right?
Well, the Predator class needs the 5G so they can, bring in this next Internet of Things.
Yeah, bring in smart cities and the whole, big grid. And so I think, if you were to ask me what's the best way to combat this? It's to, throw away your Netflix, throw away those things that actually take advantage of these processes. Because if there's no market for those processes, then they can't afford to keep them in place, and there's no reason to have them in place, right? But how many of us are really willing to give up our cell phones, to give up our Netflix, to give up our, internet down speed, our internet download speeds, all these things that actually keep this system in place? Those are all the things that keep these waves, these 5Gs in place. If we could just say, hey, I don't want a 5G phone, I don't need, navigation on my phone. I can look at a map, I don't need all these things. Have they really made my life that much better?
You're still going to get radiated whether you want it or not, even if you stop using it.
Well, as long as the towers are in place, yes, you would still get radiated. But my point being is, if there's no support structure for all these things, why are they building them, and how are they going to support those structures? If we're paying every month, Verizon to build 5G phone towers, and we're paying for our Amazon subscriptions to movie services and all these kind of things, it's amazing, because now that I have Amazon, I look back and I go, my TV was just the same, because now I'm getting commercials. I mean, the only difference is I can maybe have some on-demand movies that I couldn't get before. I had to wait for them to come on or look at the TV guide or something. So I have much more convenience, but at a very, very high price.
I stopped watching. I don't watch any television ever. I turned it off completely. I watched so much of it. I watched 25 lifetimes worth.
Yeah. But we've just changed over. We watch a lot of YouTube now, right? Which is the same thing as TV. It's just a
well, I don't watch anything like TV though. I mean, it was 24 hours a day. People leave around time around here, nonstop.
Yeah. So, so we like these services, we like these things. But, it's funny because I was looking at like the difference between a 3G download and a 5G. Well, you can download a HD movie in, 3.1 seconds or something compared to, 5 seconds the other. Like, really? That's what we're giving up? That's why we need 5G. That's why we need these waves that are going to radiate and kill us all for.
That's not why though. I mean, you need it because of their, nanotechnology.
Well, again, but I'm saying that the selling point is that we need it for these things, right? That it makes our life easier and all these kind of things.
Right. But
And
clearly we know that's not true though.
yes, I agree. But again, that's what I'm saying. Is that really worth what, we're giving up in health benefits and our planet and our, everything around us? And I think, the more people begin to look at this and say, maybe I don't need this 5G phone. Maybe I don't need this. Maybe I don't need to, listen to Pandora and go back to a radio again. We'll see if that may change some of our world. If we can change the infrastructure, if we can change demand, if we can change the market, then they have to actually justify it for what they really want it for, rather than, to meet our needs. And we can see if that would work. So it will really, it's going to really take, I think, a mass effort on humanity's part to give up some of the services that are actually promoting and providing for these technologies to stay in place.
And when we go away from those things, not just for the health benefit, we realize that we will focus on finding, I guess, a higher self, and we will start being able to telepathically communicate. You see, with these waves going around, it's like an extension of, it's an example of, how we could communicate, but there's better ways,
And
know that when you're very connected with somebody, you just take something and they'll know that they think that you're thinking that, that's the next, the next. So yeah, putting our focus on these technologies all the time takes us away from what we could possibly be,
these technologies,
in addition to the health part. I mean,
and these technologies are actually interrupting our brain wave patterns.
Yes. Well, they're interrupting our sleep patterns, which makes that we don't get that rest that we need. And also when we sleep at the right time, the dream state, the good messages that we might get through that is interrupted, eh? Like, if you get up at night and you would write down some ideas that's coming down, but with all this stuff going on, I think it's getting more difficult.
It's getting more difficult for me to meditate. I know that when I'm
That's what I mean. Like,
that has a lot of wave activity that it's very, I feel it's very hard to concentrate. And that's one thing that we saw. And so what were some of the detriments of these waves is the ability to concentrate and to think clearly. And a lot of people are seeing that now. So yeah, I mean, to detoxify, right, to get to an area which is lower waves and so on, it's going to be beneficial, and to get away from the technologies. But again, I'll be one of the first to say it's going to be difficult for me to put that down. It will get easier as I actually form a life that doesn't incorporate it as much. But again, that's a different lifestyle that I have to look at to say, how can I actually engage a lifestyle that doesn't really incorporate this as much, or find alternatives to that. One could be getting this up, going back to a land phone line. I mean, how many of us have those anymore? And they're still available. And
I still have mine.
and
they're not land phone lines anymore. They're fucking.
What are they?
VoIP.
Yeah.
Voice over IP.
Yeah, but they still.
Well, some of them I still have. Well, yeah, I don't have my phone line through my internet provider. You know what I mean? Like if you don't watch and you go for these packages, I've told my family, watch when the wireless goes down. If your phone goes down, that means you don't have a true landline.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have to fight to keep that. It's not easy, you know, and some places they won't even come to install it anymore. So, but yeah, I know what you mean.
The magnetic switching, they've disabled it in the US, like 99.9%. The magnetic switching,
Wow.
you
Wow.
can't have analog lines. It just doesn't exist.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's not because we want to go backward. We just want some, well, we want the technology to serve us and be to be not detrimental to us. So there's got to be better ways.
Giselle, to your point, if we evolve to the point where we can communicate telepathically, then that would completely destroy the market for all this other stuff.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, I mean, totally.
And then it'll just go away.
And, well,
So-
we're gonna focus on something. So the attrition, you know, that attrition, by attrition, okay, just like and I'm not saying they have their benefit, all those church that we have around the world, and there's still people going to them and it's got benefit, but slowly, be it a small town, being in the city I'm in, we go away from that. It just deteriorates, it just disintegrates because we're focusing on something else, you know, on the next evolution. So you're completely right. Like it will get there. But in the meantime,
In the
is
meantime,
what you said, William, our trees, like the trees I have by the water. Yeah, like I've been watching them deteriorate. It's very sad, really, because yeah, it's so we have to learn about this orgone energy or we have-
Biogeometry also, I mean, we can do things to actually strengthen, you know, our environments. And I think Doug was saying how he watched my video I just put out on biogeometry and using Google Earth, because as we begin to draw in these other energies and actually begin to strengthen our environments, we can actually use different energy systems to strengthen not only, you know, our bodies, but our environments around us, and also with that, the trees and different things that are being fed detrimentally by these waves. So with that being said, thank you all for joining. Thank you all for discussing this topic with me, being a part of this. Please like and subscribe. Also, all those out there who watch these videos, please make some comments about what you'd like to hear or what your ideas are, because it always helps us as you put forth what you're thinking. That's how we can either, you know, talk about subjects that have meaning to you and make these videos better. So with that, thank you all. Thanks everybody for joining. And I am now going to stop the recording.
thanks, Will.